Hello and welcome to Cafe DC. I'm Faiz Rahman. Our guest today is Michael Kugelman, a prominent author, researcher, and a columnist. He's with us here today, and thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to have you here on the show. And it was, I know, a very last-minute invitation, but you made it. Thank you. So let's just talk about some of your recent works that you have done on Pakistan. Mm-hmm. You've been writing for some Pakistani publications, especially for Dawn, a column, mm-hmm. and then the book that you just edited. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy here, but we'll get one. Pakistan's Runaway Urbanization. And then a lot of people wrote for this book, including the current Federal Minister Ahsan Iqbal and other prominent researchers and social scientists. What was that about? Why do you think it's so alarming that Pakistan, in the intro actually it says, in 10 years, almost half of Pakistan's population would be living in urban centers? Mm-hmm. How did you reach this conclusion, this assessment, number one? Number two, and why that's such a big issue?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be here on the show. Thank you. This question of urbanization is an interesting one in Pakistan because there hasn't been a census conducted in the country for many years, since 1998. And it makes it very difficult to make any sort of demographic projections overall.
Exactly, that was my...
Right, that's probably what you're getting at. Mm-hmm. I think this conclusion that, again, to repeat, that Pakistan will be almost 50% urban within the next 10, 12 years or so, this comes from statistics and data that have been compiled by a number of different organizations, from UN to a variety of others. These numbers keep coming up again and again. But I would actually argue that it could be much more serious than that. That's sort of the conventional wisdom, that it's a third, the population is a third urban now, it'll be 50% urban in 10, 12 years. In fact, if you define urban differently, if you define urban not just in terms of cities as demarcated by borders and administrative markers, things like that, but if you define urban by density, in other words, when you have large numbers of people packed into small areas, even if it's not inside cities, if you define urban in that way, then in fact Pakistan today is nearly 2/3 urban. So this suggests, if you're looking at Pakistan not just in terms of Karachi, Lahore, all the major cities, but also looking at the sprawl, the fact that you have large numbers of people living 10, 15, 20 miles outside of these major cities, you include those people in the number of people that are considered urban, then you come out with this figure, which is really quite striking. Almost 2/3 is urban
right now,
today.
as we speak. Right. But I think there are also like two directions of urbanization. I mean, two aspects to it. Mm-hmm. Number one, city expanding.
Right.
Or, actually, people moving to current urban centers, mm-hmm. from villages, countryside, or the urbanization of the villages and the countryside, or creating more cities, as is happening in America.
Exactly.
You have urban areas, then suburban areas, and suburban areas. Mm-hmm. So what is it exactly? I mean, you are people moving to these big urban centers like Karachi, Lahore, Faisalabad, Rawalpindi, Islamabad, mm-hmm. Peshawar, or they are creating more cities, mm-hmm. or urban centers other than these big names that we just mentioned?
Right, it's actually both. I mean, on the one hand, you have the fact that these traditional cities, mm-hmm. Karachi, the megacity, and Lahore and Islamabad and all of the others, because of Pakistan's natural population growth, the overall population is growing. That means that these major cities are growing as well. So there are more people being added to the roles of the population figures. And also, as you suggested, people are migrating into these major cities from rural areas for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're fleeing earthquakes and floods. Sometimes they're looking for better job prospects. Sometimes they've been displaced because of conflict and war. So for all these reasons, you have people engaging in this rural to urban migration. But as you suggest, it's very true that you have villages, small towns, that are all of a sudden taking on the forms of being urban, even though they're not large megacities. And this is part of, just modernization, industrialization. You're seeing what one would consider the trappings of urban life. You're seeing these things. I'm talking about, cars, electronics, internet access, things like that. You're seeing more of that in rural areas than you had before. And this is considered part of urbanization because, as I said...
And why that's bad? Like, why is it like an issue to be concerned with?
Well, no, I mean, to clarify...
that part of the urbanization process.
That's actually not necessarily bad. I mean, I see that as really, as a good sign to have these services, these modern services, telecommunications upgrades.
I mean, if they have good hospitals in those, areas, good schools, colleges, universities, and like in most developed countries,
right?
That's what they do. I mean, rather than moving to the big cities, we have seen in the 80s and in the 90s a different phenomenon that people were just like moving away from the major urban areas to these countryside and creating their own life with all these amenities intact and very, well lived life, basically.
No, that's a good thing. And to clarify, I don't see that as a bad thing at all. And again, if you have an increase in services, and as long as you could provide basic services, jobs, etc., to these types of these populations in these traditionally rural settings, that's good. I think we sound the alarm in the book, Pakistan's Runaway Urbanization. We really sound the alarm in the context of the big cities that are having more people coming into them, because it's the municipal authorities just cannot provide for them today. There's water shortages, energy shortages in cities. The labor market is very tight, so it's very difficult for people, for authorities to ensure that there are jobs for people in cities. And the issue is, if there are these problems now, if there's this natural resource crunch, this employment crunch now, what happens 10, 15 years from now when these cities have grown even larger? It raises a lot of questions about capacity and who's going to be providing these services, where's the money going to come for it, is there the technical capacity to get this done? That's where the concern is. And as you say, it's a very different matter, a very distinct matter from this issue of going to the hinterland, so to speak, the rural areas, and seeing this building up of these areas.
Well, I didn't want to spoil, the book, the content of it, and we don't want to discuss too much of it. I think people should be able to get hold of this book, at least on the internet, I guess, right? They can.
It is available from the internet. Yes.
Yes, and then they can read some of those articles. So, well, let's go to a little lighter side. I mean, you have been a very accomplished writer, researcher, and you work with this very prominent think tank, which is the Woodrow Wilson Center. And our viewers, they know about this center. We have done a few programs before on the center itself. But the pictures of you that appear in newspapers and books and everything, I was just wondering, who's this teenage guy writing so serious stuff about so dense and difficult subjects? And so you have a slight beard. Is it because you want to look a little older than what you are, or you just like have deceiving looks?
The latter. If you look at these pictures of me accompanying my articles online, you don't see the gray hairs that are sort of, especially in the side of my head. They're there. I guess perhaps I have a baby face, so maybe that's the answer to the question.
Well, your pictures are like perfect. Exactly. I mean, you should be happy with those looks, but they don't do justice with your work and what you how you look on screen, especially. So good. So any tips that you want to share before we take a short break and come back?
Well, just I can't really answer that. I just try to keep myself healthy, but
stay happy.
I do have the gray hair. Stay happy. Yes, exactly.
Michael will take a very short break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about some more international issues and also some matters about Pakistan. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
I think that India and Pakistan are doing pretty well for themselves without any sort of U.S. Mediating role.
Welcome back. I'm Faiz Rahman, and we are talking to Michael Kugelman of Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Michael, we talked about your book, and let's talk about your writings that you have done, recent columns actually. One column that you wrote in Wall Street Journal about Kerry's recent visit to India. And then you gave 3 distinct reasons why he should have made this visit. amongst all this chaos that he was trying to, resolve. The Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and then everything aside, and he just chose to make this quick trip to India. A lot of good statements and signals came out of those meetings. But why do you think it was important for Kerry? Those who haven't heard or read that article, why would you think so, that he had to make this trip?
Sure. Well, I mean, very briefly, there are three reasons. One is that the U.S. has insistently said that it wants to try to convince India that it really values India. It values the relationship with India. Many in India, as I'm sure you and your listeners would know, believe that the U.S. has really set India aside and has been focused on other things, like the war in Afghanistan. So John Kerry, in my view, what better way for him to show Washington's commitment to India than by going to India at this very time when the world is really burning. When you've
but there's also another argument that Indians actually don't crave for this attention from the United States anyway. I mean, they think they're fine, they're doing fine. So why would, is it in the interest of the United States to basically go and talk to the Indians, or it was the other way around, that the Indians wanted to have him come and have these discussions and meetings?
No, I mean, I'm quite sure that this was a trip for Kerry that was much more important for the United States than for India, because I think that ever since Narendra Modi became Prime Minister, there's been this realization in Washington that the U.S. needs to convince India that it really does care about it and wants to renew, deepen the relationship, and particularly since it had denied a visa to this new Prime Minister for almost 10 years. I think Narendra Modi and the new government are much more focused on economic recovery than they are about foreign affairs, including relations with the United States. So I'm sure they were delighted to welcome John Kerry, and we know that Mr. Modi is scheduled to visit Washington in September. But I think this is really for the U.S. to try to make an impression on the Indians. And you hear the types of rhetoric and the words coming out of Kerry's mouth when he was there, just effusive praise, talking about incredible opportunities to renew this partnership, exciting possibilities. I mean, it's really exaggerated, but I think this is part of this effort to really demonstrate a U.S. enthusiasm and commitment to the relationship with India.
As a South Asia expert at the center, Woodrow Wilson Center, and of course your background in your educational background also, do you think the Americans have been able to exercise some kind of a balance in that region between all the countries, including China?
No, the answer is no. I think the United States has had a hard time with that. We hear on an official level, public level, from the U.S. government that it's focused on this rebalance to Asia. So it really wants to engage the region more wholly. But in fact, it hasn't been that way. I mean, I would argue that if you look over the last 10 years or so, initially, when the George W. Bush administration was in power, there was a big focus on India, on getting that relationship to work. But then, once Bush left, Obama came in, we sort of turned our attention, turned the strategic lens, so to speak, over to the war in Afghanistan, and by extension to Pakistan. President Obama took ownership over the war in Afghanistan. And I think that India was sort of left behind.
But I think, if I remember it correctly in your article, you also mentioned that because India wasn't cooperating on the nuclear, the civilian nuclear deal, so to speak, when they signed, they gave contracts to the European companies rather than to the Americans. So the Americans weren't very happy with the way that the whole relationship was, moving into that direction, the direction that it took.
Right.
So they weren't happy. So it was one of the reasons that some, analysts, that's what they say. So do you think that was also one of the reasons that they just, U.S. kind of thought, no, yes, we tried to have this relationship, this strategic relationship, and it didn't work in the best economic interest of the United States. So that's why just back off a little bit. Was it the case?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a term that you hear in this town a lot about the U.S.-India relationship is that it was oversold, that expectations were raised tremendously during the George W. Bush years when the Civil Nuclear Accord was signed. It was seen as a milestone agreement, the beginnings of a strategic partnership. Whereas the US and India have had a lot of problems, a lot of tensions over the years. These are two countries that really weren't talking to each other for much of the Cold War. I mean, the US had arguably better relations with Pakistan during those years than it did with India. And it's really only the last, really since the 1990s when the US relationship with India has improved, and yet there's still a lot of baggage, a lot of tensions, and
the Cold War baggage, yeah.
Yeah, but also just with, more recently what happened last year with this this consular official in New York, who was, the Indians were very unhappy with how she was treated, and that sort of brought all these lingering tensions to the fore. So, and with this nuclear deal, it's ironic that this was seen as a symbol of greater cooperation, and yet no one's really been able to take advantage of it here because of these liability rules that make it very difficult, or make U.S. companies very reluctant to go to India and invest in India's energy because they're afraid of how they could get sued or and all that type of thing. So it's a pretty complicated relationship. We talk about how complicated the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is, but I guess all relationships are complicated.
Exactly.
It's like that in life and in world affairs.
Michael, you interact with being an expert on South Asia. You interact a lot with the Indians, with the Pakistanis, and of course with the Afghans. And you hear lots of conspiracy theories, when you travel or you just talk by talking to them. Do you think those societies have been fair with the United States positions on several world issues, some of them affecting these societies directly and some of them just, doesn't really matter? So what's your take? What do you think of those theories?
Well, I mean, yeah, there are plenty of theories we could talk about. I always say this when it comes to conspiracy theories, and particularly in the Pakistan context. Pakistan, it is a joke that conspiracy theories are the only growth industry in Pakistan because they're so popular. They proliferate all the time. What's unfortunate, though, is that, yes, most of them are nonsensical and ridiculous. The idea that somehow the United States manipulated weather patterns to cause the floods in Pakistan in the summer of 2010, ridiculous. But unfortunately, U.S. policies do often end up proving some of these conspiracy theories true. Like this idea that the CIA is everywhere in Pakistan, that it's crawling around wreaking havoc. After the Raymond Davis affair, we saw that indeed there was a U.S. spy that was wreaking havoc, and even though the U.S. was trying to deny it.
And then this Dr. Shakil Afridi case.
I was just going to say that, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing about this is that when U.S. policies do these types of things, it strengthens conspiracy theorists, which in turn tends to embolden these hardline forces. There's nothing better than getting a boost to your argument and having something proven true that puts it in a better light. And ultimately, this is just unfortunate for U.S.-Pakistan relations. I mean, the fact that you had a Pakistani doctor working with the CIA, engaging in a fake vaccination campaign. In my view, it was for a good end to track down bin Laden. But in some cases, the means really don't justify the ends. And in the context of a very important relationship that was really damaged, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, because of that.
Since we're on the subject, we have to take a break, but I'm just going to ask this question anyway, delay this break a little bit. Do you think the critics of U.S. policy, they've been fair in attacking the policy, knowing that America is a very complex society itself, the separation of powers, there are several power centers. Obama is not just one person making decisions. Even Congress can do much about just one piece of policy.
Right.
So is there, through your interaction, do you know that there's enough or not enough understanding of the complexity of U.S. society?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always been impressed that Pakistanis really do understand the United States very well, to an extent, much better than Americans understand Pakistan. Most Americans probably wouldn't be familiar with Pakistan at all. To the extent that they've heard of it, it's through this very narrowly defined angle of terrorism and that type of thing, the country where bin Laden was found. But I would argue that Pakistani's understanding of the U.S. tends to be, in my view, I don't want to say limited, but perhaps a bit naive when it comes to balance of power issues, how policy making is done. Oftentimes there are more than 500 congressmen on Capitol Hill. And every now and then, one of them, a hard-line one, will say something very provocative, such as one or two have talked about how Baluchistan should be a separate country. It's caused a lot of concern in Pakistan. Yeah, exactly. But of course, one congressman doesn't have much power at all, particularly when he's just saying something like that.
But we have seen such power in the past. Charlie Wilson.
Yeah.
You know, he was one member of Congress.
I would argue there are a lot of differences between
that
two
scenario
different cases.
and this,
but I think, as you say, the U.S. government, you've got an executive branch and a legislative branch that both have their own sets of powers. There's the judiciary, that's a separate matter. But I think sometimes there's this view that one individual from either branch can actually have more power than he or she actually is given by the law. And also, you've heard there have been all these rumors floating around in Pakistan over the years about prison swaps involving Afia Siddiqui, and there's been this theory that she could just be swapped, whisked away from the jail she's in. I think she's in New York State or wherever. But in fact, she's under the jurisdiction of state. Yeah, she's under state government jurisdiction. The U.S. government, I mean, I guess anything's possible, but it would be very unlikely for Washington just to order this type of thing.
But, with the same token, do you think, yes, the common man is just one story, but do you think there is enough understanding in the power structure here in the United States? Said they also understand the complexity of Pakistani society or Indian society or the Afghan society. For example, Raymond Davis, he was also going through the same judicial process in Pakistan, but John Kerry went, with his plane to basically yank him out of Pakistan just because he thought he wasn't, he had this diplomatic. So, yes, asking in the reversal, I mean, do you think, forget about the common man, but the State Department, the Congress, the White House, do they understand Pakistan and other societies that well?
No, I would argue that they do, and that goes for the intelligence community, it goes for the State Department, all the various U.S. government agencies. Congress is a bit different because you're dealing with elected officials that represent a constituency. They're not necessarily foreign policy experts. But within the executive branch, USAID, State, even Department of Treasury, all these agencies, I really think there is quite a good understanding of Pakistan. The only problem is that within the U.S. government, there tends to be a lot of transitions and turnovers. So you could have people that are working on the Pakistan desk for a year or two, and then they're sent elsewhere. And that's unfortunate because it's hard to build even more knowledge if you're rotating around so much. But one thing I wish there was more, not necessarily understanding of, but appreciation for, is that Pakistan has many challenges that go well beyond terrorism and militancy. I do wish there was more attention in this town to Pakistan's energy crisis, its water shortages, education challenges, healthcare. There's a lot there, and in my view, these types of things affect many more people in Pakistan directly than does terrorism and militancy, as serious as that latter terrorism thing is. So it's not that U.S. government officials aren't aware of these things, but they're so narrowly focused on the security angle because when it comes down to it, U.S. interests in Pakistan are determined by security interests, getting Pakistan to help the United States on security issues, helping achieve U.S. interests. Doesn't sound very good, but I think that's what a lot of this comes down to.
Michael, we already missed our break, so we're just going to continue. And let's change the subject, not exactly change the subject, but we were talking about militancy and conflicts in Pakistan. So let's broaden the horizon a little bit. You see so many flash points across the the planet, the Middle East, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Pakistan, so many other, Africa for that matter. So there was an article in the Atlantic magazine, and actually I have a copy here, and it's a very thought-provoking paper. Actually, it's quite a long paper, and they're asking just how likely is another world war. Again, as an expert on these international affairs, what do you think is going on? Are we already in some people are saying this already, that in different opinion articles, op-eds, that yes, the world is actually going through a third world war. What do you think? What do you say about this? Are we going through one? Can we have one? How likely it is, and how bad it's going to be?
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a question weighing on many minds, particularly since just recently we celebrated the 100-year anniversary of World War I. I tend to be relatively optimistic on this. I think it's very unlikely we're going to have another world war. I think that what's more likely is that we could have a regional war, whether in the Middle East, because given how the dynamics of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, you have militancy that's spilling over borders, and the sectarian issue really transcends borders there. So I worry that there could be, perhaps, if things really deteriorate, a broader regional war. And you also have to worry about Asia, about East Asia. All of these competing claims to these islands, and that Japan and China and Korea, all kinds of countries are claiming. You have to worry about that. And in that particular case, given the U.S.'s relationship to some of these countries, particularly Japan, has a very close alliance with Japan. If Japan is dragged into a war, what would that mean for the U.S. role? But I don't see these things as world wars. We don't have these alliances that we used to have, and a lot of these conflict points, these tension points, they're not very related, right? I mean, in East Asia, you have territorial disputes over islands. In the Middle East, you have militancy,
in 1914, you used to have some. I mean, there are some similarities, and then, of course, huge differences between these two situations. 100 years ago, when the First World War started, what would it like? Yeah, please continue.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to.
No, I would just agree with you that, and nation states they act very differently now. I think that it's not like one could say there's a silver lining from the fact that we've had several world wars, but I think that countries know how horrendous war can be, and particularly given how some of these wars have ended, how World War II ended, the atomic bomb in Japan.
Millions of people.
Yeah, right. The idea of another global conflagration, I think, is just, and also the fact that they're nuclear. There are many more countries now.
So you don't see any
weapons.
chance of MAD, so to speak, mutually assured destruction.
I cannot imagine that happening, and that goes for. I mean, of course, India, Pakistan is the one nuclear flashpoint that people worry about more than anything else. I just think that cooler heads will prevail, and I don't
Just a quick, we almost out of time here, just a quick brief answer. Do you think the United States needs to do more for India and Pakistan for that? You just mentioned it's such a flashpoint. Do you think the U.S. has been involved enough?
I think that India and Pakistan, their relationship has really softened. It's improved over the last few years, really through soft diplomacy, confidence-building measures, movement toward a formal trade relationship. I think that India and Pakistan are doing pretty well for themselves without any sort of U.S. mediating role. And the problem with this dynamic is that if India and Pakistan are to reconcile, it'll involve dealing with the Kashmir problem. And I think that India, of course, has a position where it really sees everything as resolved. It doesn't want any sort of outside mediation, because that would suggest that there's a need to talk about things. I don't think India wants to go there. So I think that the idea of having the U.S. get involved, it could work to an extent. Certainly if it's behind the scenes, very private, very subtle, certainly. And even if it with a very modest objective, such as Washington trying to get the two countries to finally finalize this most favored nation relationship. That would go a long way. It would be a great confidence-building measure. It wouldn't mean there'd be a peace treaty, but it would be something to look forward to.
Very good. Thank you very much, Michael.